And what I've introduced, the amount of geography, and our other lecturers have shown you, is essentially the two polar regions. I say again, the frozen ocean surrounded by continents, the frozen continents surrounded by oceans. By happy coincidence, they're both about 1.5 million square kilometers. But the compare and contrast could be quite a long lecture, and time is a serious problem always, even on a sea day. There's some big and substantial differences between the Arctic winter and summer. These two maps show you the circumstances. In winter, it is surrounded by sea ice, frozen sea. Very difficult for a ship to penetrate. And you can get a rough idea from that map that in the winter, effectively, the sea ice is the same volume as the same area, as the land. A vast, difficult, amazing problem for investigation and knowing what is there. It's taken time to make these discoveries. Now, a little bit more geography also. The captain showed you, and showed to the first officer, the circumstances of the Antarctic convergence and its importance. Here the Southern Ocean is the darker grey. You have the limit round it of the cold water and the warmer waters of the Indian, Pacific and South Atlantic Oceans reaching there. I need not say much more, you've already heard that to some extent. That is the biological, the geographical limit of entering the Southern Ocean. In this case, leaving the Atlantic, you're a little further to the west, the Pacific, and you're in the peri-Antarctic waters, the Southern Ocean. There is the 60-degree limit, which is quite clear on that map. That, I suppose, we could say is the diplomatic, the political limit. That is the Antarctic Treaty. And astronomically, of course, there is the polar circle. As the captain mentioned, we'll not go south of it, but the Arctic Circle and the Antarctic Circle, where for a period the sun never sets and sun never rises on the solstices. 6 months of dark in the North and the South Pole. Now, that's one side, but look at the other side, which is rather colourful. Around the Antarctic, in the Southern Ocean, there are 19 peri-Antarctic islands, little scraps of land, small islands, all around the Southern Ocean, and some of the far southern extremes of the other oceans. South Georgia is a major one, and those of you who know the Shackleton story will know that Shackleton called South Georgia the gateway to the Antarctic. Now, if you consider these little islands as access going further south, they're all to some extent gateways to the Antarctic. The exploration, the unveiling of the Antarctic use these islands a lot. The one you can see on the right, the colourful one, that's all of the islands. They're done to exactly the same scale. So you can see upper right, Elephant Island in the South Shetlands group. That's the extremes of that one. But you get the south, Kerguelen is the largest. Now, I've found out yesterday from the audience that if I use the red pointer, it's difficult for me to see and you can't see it. So I'll either wave my arms or say upper right and upper left, which will also be good for the people in the cabins who similarly can't see what I point here. Right, set the geography. Remember my previous lecture? I showed you these stages of exploration. This is how the unveiling takes place. Yesterday I spoke particularly about the continental penetration, the heroic age. But notice at the end of all those dates there's a small squiggle. They overlap. There are no watertight compartments in the historical continuum. These are just major themes. Back to the ancient Greeks, thinking of the huge theoretical continent, that was the Terra Australis, which barely existed. 1800s, major exploitative industry working in the Southern Ocean, sealers for fur seals and elephant seals. Exploitation? Over-exploitation. Then the brief but intense period as the interior of the continent was found. Then, well, I told you in my first lecture, that finished. The Second World War caused a lapse of exploration throughout the world, but then whaling in the Southern Ocean. That was another over-exploitation between the wars. And the permanent stations. Antarctica has had a constant population since 1944, which in my opinion was a very good year. Then comes the Antarctic Treaty. But I'll go through these sequentially. Terra Australis, the idea of land was known in the north, the earth was known to be a sphere, the idea there'll be something similar in the south to balance it. Otherwise, I suppose you might suggest it could wobble, which is a good thing to mention aboard a ship. Absolute rubbish, of course. So huge theoretical land areas were put there, and the whole time it was slowly decreasing. Interestingly too, some of the earliest maps you have here from 1516, the Southern Cross, the stars you can see in the middle of the map, because voyages were going south, they could see the stars of the Southern Hemisphere. Now many of those of you from South America, from Australia, South Africa will know this very well, the constellation in the sky. The night sky, we don't get much night, but with those of you from the Southern Hemisphere, make sure that people from the Northern Hemisphere have seen this. That's the best way. All the Southern Hemispheres know what it is. The Southern Cross was on the maps, and the heavens were mapped well before the Earth. I spoke of these huge maps. Look at that far southern continent. In reality, that's a combination of Australia, the Antarctic, and a great deal of ocean that's shown as land. All theory. Steadily voyages, some intentional, some blown off course and in trouble, were going south and south and south, further south and not getting anywhere. It was Captain Cook made the first circumnavigation. On 3 occasions, first in 17th of January 1773, his ships crossed the Antarctic Circle. Sadly, the places, well, not sadly, unfortunately, the places where they crossed the circle, also the places where the coast of the Antarctic went far south. Otherwise, he'd have run into it. I like this illustration. They're taking water from the ship. The Ice Islands, 9th of January 1773. Can't quite read the title, but take my word for it. And that's how they did ornithological research. You'll see a fellow letting fly with a blunderbuss and picking up what comes down. Science was different in those days. After his Cook made 3 voyages. After his circumnavigation, the second one, he wrote a detailed account of it. There's the book. He reported on South Georgia in particular, and some of the other places, vast numbers of fur seals. During this voyage, he spent the summer in the north and found areas, particularly in the Far East, where there was a trade in the pelts. So not only did he find the seals, he found somewhere where there was a considerable profit to be made in selling their pelts. So from that time, really sealers began to work in the Antarctic. Also the maps. Cook had circumnavigated, he'd gone south twice, gone far south during his circumnavigation, and did not find any ancient continent. There's the map published after Cook. It's gone. Now the opposite happens. There is a continent there, as we know, we're on the way to it. So from those periods, late 1700s, as real discoveries occurred, slowly the continent began to increase in size. Big theoretical one vanishes and a real one begins to grow. Only about a couple of 100 years ago this was starting. I mentioned the sealing. The rough dates. The peri-Antarctic islands, the gateways to the Antarctic, were exploited enormously. First for fur seals. You can see those. There's a slide on the left. Their fur is their insulation. They're shallow divers. And there are vast numbers. That's South Georgia, with plenty of king penguins in the background. On the right are the elephant seals. Deep divers, a lot of blubber on them. The blubber is insulation, it's food reserve. In the Antarctic, I tend to gather a bit of that myself, perhaps we all do here. And it's buoyancy. The sealers could make a profit from the seal pelts substantially. The elephant seal, then it was the blubber, it was the oil that made the profit, so it wasn't quite so profitable. But they were going around the islands, citing some of the earliest aspects of the Antarctic continent, and it was over-exploitation. There's good news in this too. Seal populations have recovered. There's good news for the whales too, their populations are recovering. Sealers were very secretive. If they found an island with vast numbers of seals, you had to shut up about it. You didn't want competition. So we don't know where many of them went. A bit of detective work helps. Here's James Weddell, after whom the Weddell seal and the Weddell Sea are named. He was one of the sealers who wrote excellent accounts of it some years after he finished, and went far south in the sea that now bears his name. He did actually take a Weddell seal. There's the skin of it that's still in the National Museum in Scotland. They didn't look like that, do they? I think the instructions that the taxidermist had was get as much stuffing in it as you possibly can. When you see seals, you'll realise that, well, the first indication wasn't perhaps the best. Well, in his diary and log, and later in his book, was actually drawing maps. Here are some of the South Shetland Islands. We'll be visiting these, some real islands. Many of them have the names that Weddell gave. He did it so effectively well. Now, I'm not going to use the pointer, but if I walk over here and show you a place called Robbery Beaches, that's where, after the fur seals became decidedly rare, the exploitation was rapid. Too many ships too quickly, a gold rush on them. That's where the sealers spent effectively more time trying to club each other than club seals. Oh. We have very few illustrations of them. Here we have Deception Island, a few seals around. You see one's about to join the club for its pelt. And this island, well, this is the volcanic one with various changes over. You remember on the first sighting of the Antarctic continent, my colleague Joe referred to Bellingshausen, the Russian navigator. He did a similar journey to Captain Cook over about 50 years later. He crossed the Antarctic Circle 6 times. And near the zero meridian, he reached the ice shelf. Now, this takes a little bit of understanding. He did not claim to have sighted the continent or anything of that nature. He did claim to have seen vast ice cliffs. Here we have Mørny and Vostok, his ships. And a statistic for all of you, ladies and gentlemen. 90% of the ice on Earth is in the Antarctic. 9% is the Greenland ice sheet. That leaves 1% for everywhere else. The oceans, it's only floating. It's a couple of meters thick, so work out the numbers. But seeing those ice cliffs is very much the outskirts of Antarctica. I'm content that was the first practical indication that there was something huge there, we now know as the continent. Mapping. The title of this lecture is Unveiling the Antarctic. Well, look, 1831, sealers have discovered the South Shetland Islands. They're on the map. Several of the peri-Antarctic islands are on the map. This is an honest map. It doesn't show what it doesn't know. It's published by a magnificent Victorian society that sadly no longer exists. I like the idea of the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. I suppose we're all members one way or another, aren't we, ladies and gentlemen? Anyway, the sealing period was on. Most voyages to the Southern Ocean were sealers. But 1837, 38, 39, 3 voyages set out from France, United States, and Britain, all with the object of determining the position of the South Magnetic Pole as accurately as possible. Not only where it was, but at what rate it's moving. The magnetic poles, north and south, aren't in a constant position. The first out was Jules Sebastian César Dumont d'Urville. There he is, with 2 vessels, Astrolabe and Zele. There they are, on the coast of Antarctica. We have some artists who produced paintings of this. This is 1840, with their landing, and indeed, that's the basis of the French claim for the Antarctic. The United States expedition, led by Charles Wilkes, the United States Exploring Expedition was the formal title, was to go around much of the world, particularly the Pacific Ocean. The Antarctic was just a sub-branch. They sailed along much of the coast from the Ross Sea, I'll mention Ross in a moment, mapping coastal areas roughly south of Australasia. We have a few illustrations of this. I rather like this one. There was a party on the ice. As you can see, there's the ships, vast amount of pack ice. Notice the dog. The name was Sydney. They picked that up when they visited New South Wales, when they visited Australia. Wilkes had several ships that he was A little bit of an argumentative fellow. It was a long time before the results of the expedition were published. And let's say he wasn't the most popular captain. The next one was the British one. By that time, Royal Navy, after the Napoleonic Wars, had a lot of ships, and what to do with them was a problem. Exploration was an alluring proposition, particularly the Northwest Passage. But here's James Clark Ross. He's got a polar bear skin over his shoulder. He's just come from the Arctic. And look, on the bottom right of his picture, there is a magnetometer, a dip circle for determining the position and direction of the north, correction at the south, correction again, for any magnetic pole. He used it for the north and was using it again for the south, but it works the same way. There's the two ships, Erebus and Terror, and notice the Southern Cross. He landed on a little island now known as Possession Island in the Ross Sea, subsequently named after him. And the upper illustration shows when he was there in 1841. If you look at the peaks, you can even see some caves on the bottom right of it. And there's where I was there in January 1898. You can still see the caves, the penguins are there. The rest of it's changed rather a lot. But that was the beginning of these national and political interests in that part of the world. A little further south, he got a surprise. Ross Island had Erebus and Terror, two mountains named after his ships. One of them was in eruption, that's Mount Erebus. It's the highest volcano in the Antarctic. The highest peak is considerably larger, considerably more inland. So we've had the French, the United States, and the British exploring around the continent. And for the magnetic pole, the discoverers were inevitable. So back to my subject. We have a map now from 1854. Look how much coast is appearing. Upper right, there's the Antarctic Peninsula. Lower left, there's the Ross Sea appearing with the discoveries of Wilkes, Dumont d'Urville, and partly Ross, and a few other things spotted. It is slowly unveiling. Now the sealers. We have a few illustrations of them. There's sealing taken in Elephant Seal on Kerguelen. Sometimes in these remote peri-Antarctic islands, a few sealers wintered. Not always intentionally. Some of them were producing maps, but they were usually published much later. Some of them made one-way journeys, and in this case, we know of a sealer who was buried on South Georgia. John Anderson in his name. The rest of his, we can't say a gravestone, it's a piece of copper actually with holes punched in to give the details. It gives his name, it gives the dates, what's the date of death, it gives the name of the ship he was aboard, so we can get an idea of where sealers were going on that place. These little bits of detective work fill it in. And something right at the end, if you can read the last line, would be good on any man's gravestone. It says, an honest man. Other sides of things. Ships occasionally blown off course, not going where they expected to go. Look at this illustration, 1853, from Sag Harbor in the United States. The ship, Levant, and Captain Mercator Cooper commanding it. He's drawing icebergs, but look in the middle of it, near the bottom. There's his sketch, the captain's sketch of his ship. You can just about see it, amid the size of the icebergs. It might not be the most accurate thing, but you can see a little ship in that one, I trust, ladies and gentlemen. Now the sealers. There are remains around so many of the islands. They had these cauldrons, these tripods for boiling up the oil from the elephant seals. Those taking fur seals had hardly anything left. They merely had pegs, wooden pegs on the ground. They used to peg out the pelts. No remains. The fur sealers, the elephant sealers, they had these pots. They boiled the oil, put it in barrels, so there's remains of elephant sealers on many islands. Sometimes they lived in caves. On the left you can see a cave, the Carlita Bay in South Georgia. You can see a hearth just on the bottom left. And that chap with I used to dye my beard black in those days. That's 1980. Bloody hell, that's 45 years ago, isn't it? Anyway, that was a 35mm Kodachrome slide. We all remember those, don't we? It wasn't the only thing of the period during the sealers. It was the dominant industry. But the first international polar year, And remember when I was on the tannoy yesterday talking about Romanche and the French expedition, named those glaciers. That and a German expedition on South Georgia with the Antarctic components. There's the German station. For one entire year, basic magnetic and geophysical measurements were made of still considerable value on South Georgia as science was investigating. So, ladies and gentlemen, leaping forward, unveiling the Antarctic, 1891. Look, we have rather a good map there. It's improving. There's not much imagination in it. The Weddell Sea and the Ross Sea are there. The South Shetland Islands are there. Most of the peri-Antarctic islands are there, and this map shows the number of voyages, scientific and others, that were reaching that place. Now, I trust the majority of you were at my lecture yesterday when I spoke about the attainment of the pole and the heroic age, which I mentioned then. I prefer continental penetration. Exploration of the interior of the continent was the main thing. It was a heroic age. There was another one in the Arctic, also attaining the North Pole, but every age had heroes of some sort or other. Some doing very well, some perhaps less advanced. Now those approximate dates, 1890s to stopping in the war. There was a practical and a theoretical beginning. The practical one, a sad but not uncommon story of overexploitation of marine resources, whales becoming rarer in the north, demand for whale oil remaining. Norwegian and Scottish expeditions headed south to see if there was any possibility of establishing the industry in the Antarctic. There's three ships, Jason, Herta and Castor on this one. Karl Anton Larsen, a major fellow in Antarctic history, subsequently was in command. I rather think the artist might have slightly over-exaggerated the icebergs on this one. The results? Much of the mapping of the Antarctic Peninsula. Here's details from the whalers where they were looking for anchorages, whales and things like that. At the time, the technology of the whaling industry was the Moby Dick style. It took the Norwegian invention of modern whaling to get it going. The practical side, looking south for resources. The theoretical side, what I rather like, 1895, you can date this very accurately. There was the 6th International Geographical Congress in London, and with a lot of resolutions, and some people might call it waffle, but there were things done at the end of it. And the conference decided that, as you can see here, they record that the exploration of the Antarctic regions is the greatest piece of geographical exploration still to be undertaken. It went on, written in 1895, that it should be done before the end of the century. It took longer than that, but that was the international concentration. You might remember, yesterday I showed you the first wintering south of the Antarctic Circle by the Belgica expedition in 1898, and Adrian Galash de Gomer was the commander. Here's one of the paintings from it. We'll be sailing up and down the Gerdash Strait, as you heard a few moments ago from the captain. That's what it looked like about 120 years ago, so we can check it in the next few days. Interestingly, with that expedition, Roald Amundsen was the first officer, and Frederick Cook was the medical officer. Roald Amundsen's expertise with the tents and so forth later demonstrated very effectively in the Antarctic. Frederick Cook, his work was very largely responsible with the survival of the expedition, the avoidance of scurvy. His later expeditionary career, involving a claim to the North Pole, is contentious, I think is the word, contentious. The first wintering, 1899, with Carsten Borchgrevink. There he is with his rifle. Remember I told you, he's the man who shot out the polar bears from the Antarctic. You have the hut. You have the hut remaining inside. The Antarctic Heritage Trust looks after that rather well. One man died, Nikolai Hansen. Top right is his grave, the first grave in the Antarctic. And the medical officer lying in a top bunk. There's a sketch he made of his ceiling. His, I don't know whether we've got Delilah's head or his girlfriend, but he had quite a lot of time to do some sketching on the ceiling in the hut. And that remains the first habitation in the Antarctic. The expedition didn't do very well for a number of reasons. Leadership was one. But here you see this in the middle of the slide, almost a pink triangle. It's pink, well it's orangey pink, because of the vast colony of Adelie penguins there, and they're krill eaters, so what comes out the stern of an Adelie penguin is of that colour. They were just on this little area, which was a safe place to winter, with food. The penguins and their eggs were substantial, but they were unable to go further inland. They'd wintered, but it wasn't a good place for exploration. The hut, I mentioned yesterday, was a Norwegian log cabin style building. It's still there. There's the photograph of Borchgrevink. His sponsor was George Newnes, a British newspaper owner, so he did have an extremely big flag. That wouldn't have lasted the first blizzard. The huts are still there, and I'll say again, thanks to the excellent work of the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust. Back to my subject. We're racing on, we've now reached 1900, and there's the map of the Antarctic. So much more is unveiled. You can see the continent is getting roughly the right shape. There's a few unknown areas. The Phantom Coast south of the Pacific remained really unknown until the International Geophysical Year. Back to the Royal Geographical Society's International Conference. 3 expeditions were coordinated to set out in 1901, going to different parts of the continent. Each had vastly different histories. One that spent 2 winters there intentionally was Scott. One that got caught for a second winter was the Swedish one. And the German one aboard Gauss had problems. Heschia's specially equipped ship went to an area south of the Indian Ocean, even had a balloon to get high and observe far inland. But with the ice, all these things, man proposes, God disposes, and the ice gods were against her, she couldn't reach the continent. She was drifting for the entire winter in the ice. Forays were made to the continent. This huge volcanic plug, Gaussberg, was named after the ship. But unable to do exploration, you weren't going to risk a long time away from your ship when your ship is constantly drifting and you wouldn't know where it is when you wanted to go back. The Swedish expedition, led by Otto Nordenskiöld, with the ship Antarctic, landed near the north end of the Antarctic Peninsula. And you can see the 2 illustrations. The ship was in the Falkland Islands and Tierra del Fuego, and came to pick up the expedition after the year, and as you can see from those 2 slides, everything went wrong. The ship, named Antarctic, sank. The expedition had been left in a base. You can see the little hut in the middle there, painted by the artist of the expedition, a place where there was a lot more glaciers in those days, on Snow Hill Island, just to the east of the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. They remained there for the 1902 winter. They of course stuck for the 1903 winter. A search party sent to them also got stuck. They remained at Hope Bay for the 1903 winter, 3 of them living off the land. The survivors of the ship reached Paulet Island, built a hut there, major penguin rookery. The penguins provided food, they provided, well, the pelts were used, and they were fueled also from their blubber. They lasted. 1903, 3 separate parties of that expedition. The Paulet Island men, some of them reached Snow Hill Island. The Hope Bay men, after the winter had trekked there, so were the 3 parties united there, and the Argentine vessel Uruguay reached them on what Nordenskiöld calls the Day of Wonders, the 8th of November 1903. You can still see the ship Uruguay in Buenos Aires, and everyone got out. It was quite a triumph. Scott's expedition, his first expedition, I gave you an introduction to that, with the ship Discovery wintering, and the artist Edward Wilson. I'll say more about him in a moment. There's the ship with Parhelia around her. The upper left is a view on the deck with the snow. The sails were placed over the deck to make a sort of compartment of it, but there she is wintering. The thing in the middle covered in snow, looks a bit like a head, is actually the binnacle, the magnetic compass. And our captain already discussed the importance of those a long time ago. But oh, ladies and gentlemen, bottom left, that's a postcard from the expedition. Look at the animal in it. They still haven't got that right. Discovery reached the Bay of Whales. That's on the eastern side of the Ross Ice Shelf. There she is wondering could they land there. If you look in her rigging, you'll see rather lumpy things hanging there on the left of the rigging. Those are frozen New Zealand mutton carcasses. You can understand that in those circumstances they're in the fridge. The man on the right, Edward Wilson. He had 3 capacities on the expedition. He was an amazing artist. Here's some of his work, for instance. But he was the biologist, an excellent artist, and the medical officer. Now, a biologist, to show things, should be able to sketch and do things very clearly. Art is quite a useful thing there. And with respect to the medical officers in the audience, isn't medicine merely the applied biology of a particular species of mammal? So you can see how all 3 combine with Edward Wilson. There's a lot I could say about the expedition. I gave you an introduction to it when I was talking about the South Pole, and my colleague Joe will have more to say on this subject. But here's some of the sketches of Wilson showing sledging at that time. The hut they used, they wintered aboard the ship, but the hut was on shore. There it is on the bottom left. That was for supplies. They even had dramatic performances in there in winter. The ponies were kept outside in subsequent expeditions, but every other expedition in that part of the world heading towards the South Pole used the hut. It is the most southerly hut. It was a very useful one. During the winter, Shackleton was editor of a midwinter magazine. Papers were written, and there it is, the South Polar Times. 2 versions of that, one for each winter were produced. They've been republished, and all sorts of stories written by the men on the base at the time. Some were quite formal, some had a certain sense of humour. That's something the book trade finds very, very attractive. Discovery was stuck for a year. Intentionally for the first one, couldn't get out the second one. At the end of it, then 2 more ships, Morning and Terra Nova, were sent down with the orders either extract Discovery, move everybody with her, or abandon Discovery. More, with the aid of tides and wind, all 3 got out. And that's the time when you had those 3 ships in February 1904, all extracting the expedition. Enough of Scott, let's move to Scotland. Scotia. There's the ship. She was involved with William Spears Bruce and quite a bit of oceanographic work. Here's Bruce, cartoon with a penguin. It was very much the Scottish National Antarctic Expedition. It was from Britain, but Bruce really did emphasize Scotland. It was said about him, in Bruce's hands, the thistle is very prickly. They established a meteorological station on the South Orkney Islands, one of the major groups of the peri-Antarctic Islands. That still runs. After the Scottish winter in 1903, it was transferred to Argentina and the Argentine Meteorological Service, and still runs Orcada Station. The illustration on the right is the transfer from the Scottish expedition. We have the British, Scottish and Argentine flags, and Argentina still maintains it. And the fellow with the white apron on is William Smith. He was the cook. A house was built there the next year to look after the improved laboratory. That still stands, established in January 1907, still going. It's now the museum of the Orcada Station. I mentioned Charcot, Greenland explorer, his first voyage aboard Francais. Without making a long story of this, ladies and gentlemen, I believe this picture shows you it was a French expedition. They did geophysical magnetic work around there, and I'll show you his second expedition in a few moments. Now here, I've got to think of what my learned colleague Joe will mention, and we'll give you the Shackleton story as we approach Elephant Island. So here, his expedition aboard Nimrod achieving a farthest south in the same direction, but going much further than he and Wilson took. There's a lot I could say, but I'm not going to steal my colleagues' clothes. But one thing in particular, after the first winter, the artist, George Marston, produced this painting of the penguins coming back to nest of the summer. Return of the Penguins was the title of the painting. Now there were 2 ways you could think of that. The biologists were very interested with the embryology and the development of the egg. Everybody else was very interested because it was a supply of fresh eggs. Now you know Shackleton's farthest south, where he and 3 others, total 4, one's holding the camera, reached a position roughly 1.5 degrees from the South Pole. There his diary had the comment, he was hoping that his wife would prefer a live donkey to a dead lion. If he made it, they'd have probably starved during the return journey. When he got back, well, that's what he looked like. The caption, we can't quite see all of it there, but just back from the pole, in afterlife, this tramp became the famous Sir Ernest Shackleton. But a very hard time with scurvy, frostbite and that sort of thing. The further south penetration of the continent. France again. Charcot's next voyage, Pourquoi pas, there she is, similar to Francais. But on one of the rocks near where they wintered, he carved the letters P and a line, as you can see there. I marked them in there, a bit difficult to see otherwise. PP for Pourquoi pas. No, why not? But that line was the result of 1 year carefully done tidal observations, so they had the tidal datum and the movements of the tide. With increase in sea level and other changes, that accurately done measurement in the beginning of the 1900s is of increasing interest as we can replicate and measure what is actually happening. These old data are particularly significant. Now I told you about Amundsen and the South Pole. There he is, formal, dressed in sledging gear, and how 99 days he was there and back. You'll hear more of this later. But to summarize it quickly, there's the 2 attainments of the South Pole. Norway was there 33 days before Britain. There's the illustrations of Amundsen and his 5 men, a painting, and Scott colorized the 5 men that were there. The Norwegians returned. I suppose we could say Scott and co are still in the Antarctic. It's very much a tragedy. But the question of attainment of the North Pole is difficult. It's contentious. But at the South Pole, these 2 expeditions with their records backed each other up. The letter that Amundsen left at the South Pole, which we had delivered, indeed it was delivered to the King of Norway, was his insurance. It proved he was there. Scott's party delivered it. And I mentioned briefly, with some illustrations, here we have some more. The Japanese expedition that surprised Fram there. They have Kainan Maru, the leader, Noble Shirase, and I do rather like the sketch of their daily penguin on the ice floes. There's some excellent sketches throughout the Japanese work. We're still in this continental exploration, the Filchner expedition attempting to cross it, the ship finally landing everything, finding she was on a huge tabular iceberg, having to abandon the expedition and drift north in the Weddell Sea, but further east than Shackleton's Endurance, so they survived. And everyone from Australia will know Sir Douglas Mawson, his 2 huts in the Antarctic. The vast territory, Australian Antarctic territory, as a result of Mawson's explorations in the Australasia Antarctic expedition. What remains? 2 men died on one of Mawson's treks, and there's their memorial. The hut, now looked after, was a very significant historic remain in that area, roughly due south of Melbourne, is in fairly good condition. A lot of work's been done on that. Mawson called his book The Home of the Blizzard, and there's someone leaning into wind. It was very rightly called. Mawson had some new ideas too. First use of heavier than air aircraft. Remember, Dragowski and Scott had balloons. Well, unfortunately, he was testing it in Adelaide and knocked the wings off. So it was used for hauling sledges on the ground using the propellers. It wasn't a success. But Mawson's great success was the new technology. Radio was introduced, direct communication with the Antarctic, with a station on Macquarie Island. It was 20th of February 1913 that you could make direct contact with the entire continent. Still on this period, we're coming to its end, the Shackleton story. There's the prospectus, the ship caught in the ice, the sinking of the vessel, carrying on in great difficulties to Elephant Island, the launch of James Caird from Elephant Island, then the 22 men wintering until Yelcho, the Chilean ship, You might have seen her memorial in Punta Arenas collected them and rescued that expedition. The Weddell Sea party of Shackleton's expedition, everyone got out alive. The Ross Sea party, only 7 of the 10 got out. The place which, as the captain explained a short while ago, we hope to see, is Point Wild, if nature permits us. There's the map by James Worley showing that little extension, the large rock at the end, and the 2 boats, upturned boats, that Shackleton's expedition remained on. You can see just in the middle of the picture. That's something from the actual time. If everything works, we might be able to see roughly what that looks like today. There's a photograph, this little low-lying isthmus where the 22 men camped. And Joe will tell you the story of Aurora and the Ross Sea party. Now, this is in the time of the First World War. Exploration was largely coming to a halt. But here's the map of what the Antarctic looked like. We've unveiled it to something that's getting closer to what we know. And whaling began in 1904, but it wasn't really intense till the period between the wars. So I've indicated it roughly here. First, of course, I showed you the beginning of the interests, when the whalers were looking to see if there was anything useful, and found there wasn't really with the technology they had until modern whaling was developed in Norway, when places like Grytviken, a huge factory for being able to process whales, was established. Built 1904, operating till 1965, now still around as very much historic industrial archaeology and ruins. Deception Island, which we'll be seeing, the way-in, Neptune's window, you can see at the upper right. We'll look into that part of the crater. A very good harbour, providing it doesn't erupt. And a number of whaling vessels, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 were established there at that period. That was photographed by Edward Binney, the Falkland Islands magistrate there in 1912. Whaling was not an easy profession. All whaling stations have cemeteries. This is Deception Island before it was completely covered by the volcanic eruption. There were scientific expeditions. Shackleton's quest expedition was there. Bagshaw and Leicester wintered in Paradise Bay. That's on our list. There's a little hut they had. The second international polar year had meteorological observatories on South Georgia and a research station working with whaling in the same place. There's the 2 illustrations of them. And it was also a time when, after the war, the United States became again interested in the Antarctic. Yesterday I showed you how Richard Evelyn Byrd was using aircraft, eventually going as far as the South Pole. He wintered alone for a while, deep inland, making meteorological records, and almost cost him his life with carbon monoxide poisoning. There's the illustration. And those days he was sending wire photos, you can see, transmitted from the Antarctic to New Zealand, back and forth from the world, and the publicity and results from that made vast differences. There are other changes too. There was the question, did the Antarctic Peninsula join the continent, or was it just an isolated group of islands? 1934-37, the British Grandland expedition sledged down the whole area and found this mountain range that extends from the Antarctic Peninsula into the interior. That's a story themselves, and in part of the area will be in the vicinity where they were exploring with a distinctly primitive but effective aircraft, a small boat, and of course dogs. Now, that's exploration. Remember, I was talking about whaling in this period. This is Leith Harbour in South Georgia. If you count, you can see all those whalers lined up. I think I've got about 23. I might have counted more than one. There's one out to sea. The overexploitation was enormous. Whale population was crashing. The whalers had assisted a lot of exploration because they had bases, they had ships. In Deception Island, there was a whaling station which is now industrial archaeology. The ruins of that in the harbour. A lot of the ruination was, of course, the volcano. And, ladies and gentlemen, some very quick statistics. Damn close to 1.5 million whales were taken in the Southern Ocean in a period of about 75 years, far more than the population could sustain. They were vastly reduced. The majority were taken by pelagic ships operating at sea, about 10% of the land stations on South Georgia, South Orkneys and Deception. But a tragic story, the largest catch was over 50,000. That was in 1960-61. There's stories I could tell you about that, but that was a potential disaster from many respects. The good news, whale populations are slowly but steadily increasing. Whaling effectively ceased apart from small catches of minke whale. They're slow breeders, but it was close to the brink, but on the appropriate side of the brink. Back to the subject, permanent stations. What started from, as I mentioned, a year, I found quite a good one. The questions of what was where in the Antarctic of claiming territory. The Australian map that combined maps of nearly everyone in 1939 showed territory for Britain, the Falkland Islands dependencies, Australia, the Australian Antarctic Territory, New Zealand, the Ross Dependency, France, Terra Delhi, and an interesting point of view from Norway, that's dividing it up. We like to talk about, well, you can either have pie slices or pizza slices. More about this later. 1939, there were interesting problems. War had broken out in Europe. Norwegians, who'd been working whalers along the coast, knew it well, and there's the Queen of Norway, Dronning Maud. They proclaimed Dronning Maud land only 5 days before the Third Reich claimed territory in the Antarctic. So in 1939 you had a potential claim from Germany which was not sustained, and one from Norway which still exists. That of course concentrated the minds of diplomats and those in South America on what was immediately to their side. And Antarctic territories were proclaimed by Chile in 1940, Argentina in 1943, somewhat extended in 1947. That of course with the war on worried the British, who made claims to the Falkland Islands and dependencies in 1908. I'll talk about these claims in a later lecture, you don't have to write all that down. And Operation Tabarin was launched. Now, Port Lochray we're going to see. At that time in the war, places would get secret code names, and for some reason, that was a nightclub in Paris. It's not very often in my lectures can I say, bring on the dancing girls. Well, there's one for you. And the comment was it's said to be involved much night work and was chaotic as the nightclub. Churchill was Prime Minister at the time, and he questioned why Britain's having anything to do with the Antarctic when there's a war on. What is the reason for sending an expedition of perfectly good fighting men to the South Pole? Well, the whaling industry, the products of that, not only food, but glycerin for explosives and things were significant, and stations were founded. The first was Point A in Port Lochray. We'll be going to visit that year 1944. There's a photograph of it now, maintained by the Antarctic Heritage Trust. Britain wasn't alone in Paradise Bay, as the captain mentioned. There's the Argentine station, Almirante Brown, established in 1951. Quite an amount of it burnt in 1980, but you can still see the remains of the station in what the Norwegians named Paradise Bay. Not everybody who'd wintered thought that was a good name. United States was back. Stonington Island, wintered a couple of times. Finroney was the latest one in 1947 with aircraft. You almost have a control tower there, and the remains of that are a historic site. So, we're back to pie cutting. You've seen first Britain, second New Zealand, third Australia, fourth France, fifth Norway, sixth Chile, seventh Argentina, and there has been a subsequent claim by Ecuador. Then there's the territories, and you see the very colourful bit in the middle, the British Antarctic Territory, Territorio Antarctico Chileno, and Antarctica Argentina. In polite company, we call it the ABC problem, where Argentina, Britain, and Chile don't agree. So, the permanent huts, the questions of opening fire, the difficulties of politics. Well, the Antarctic Treaty turned up, where scientists could do something politicians had found to be difficult. The International Geophysical Year covered the whole planet. Many things occurred there. One was 4th of October 1957, when the space age began with Sputnik. There's the symbol of the IGY, and I like the cartoon. It's in Punch, a newspaper in London. 12 countries were cooperating. The top one shows the Soviet Union seemed to be right gulag with the penguins. The middle bit is the US teaching them to play baseball, but they really wanted to know about Shakespeare, which the British had invented. Now, at that time, large scientific stations ended up. You've heard of McMurdo, that's the view of it from Observation Hill, the big US station that supports the South Pole Station. There's the South Pole itself. That's out of date, but I rather like that one, the geodesic dome near the South Pole. But that's been subsequently demolished. It was eventually buried with snow. That's gone. But again, the continent for science occurred. There was a bit of competition, friendly competition. If you walk from Scott Base of New Zealand to McMurdo Sound of the United States, it's about a 4-kilometre walk. There's two signs facing each other. The National Science Foundation has a very formal one. The Scott Base New Zealanders do have rather a, how shall we put it, a less formal one, as you go from very much a sort of organised to a New Zealand style operation. Soviet Union was of course there. Mermy Station, their headquarters, and they had stations in every part of the claims around the Antarctic. They had major stations and substantial work, one of the larger countries participating until 1991, when the Soviet Union fell to bits and finance became impossible to maintain. Japan, from the beginning, had stations. There's Showa Station. But getting a little bit more modern, the theme throughout the lecture, the regulatory period from about 88 coming. Scientific cooperation was going fairly well, but exploitation of the resources. The vast amounts of krill, you can see a krill swimming in the upper right, and there's some in tins. You need a lot of mayonnaise, they're only small, you've got to get them to stay on a fork. And there's huge factory ships taking krill, as well as fish and squid. The exploitation, the third period, first sealing and whaling and now the fisheries, is under reasonable but not perfect scientific control. The other big thing that happened then was one of the major Antarctic powers changed enormously. There's a ship losing its sign. Many of the fishing fleets and others, ships became available, and the number of passengers increased vastly, tourists visiting the Antarctic. New countries came in.